Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of the most fascinating and misunderstood chapters of ancient history, the era of the Anunnaki as recorded in the oldest written texts humanity has ever produced. Not the sensationalized versions you've seen on cable television or read about in popular books claiming alien intervention, but what the actual clay tablets tell us about a period when Earth itself transformed from a wild, primordial landscape into the birthplace of human civilization. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you're genuinely interested in exploring what these ancient texts actually reveal. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's remarkable how we can all gather from different corners of the globe, united by curiosity about humanity's deepest past. Now settle in, maybe dim the lights and get comfortable, because we're about to journey back over 4,000 years to examine what the Sumerians themselves wrote about the beings they called the Anunnaki and the profound changes that occurred on Earth during their time. The story we're exploring tonight comes directly from clay tablets inscribed by Sumerian scribes in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, preserved beneath the sands of a rock for thousands of years, excavated by archaeologists beginning in the 19th century, and painstakingly translated by scholars who devoted their lives to understanding this ancient language. These aren't modern interpretations or speculative theories. These are the actual words and beliefs of the people who lived in the world's first cities, who invented writing, who looked up at the night sky and down at the earth beneath their feet, and asked the same fundamental questions we still ask today. How did we get here? What forces shaped our world? What is our place in the cosmic order? The Anunnaki, according to the Sumerian texts when we read them carefully and in proper scholarly context, were not extraterrestrial miners from a distant planet. They were not genetic engineers who created humanity through DNA manipulation. They were gods, divine beings born into an already existing cosmos, members of a complex pantheon with specific roles and responsibilities, deeply embedded in the theological and cosmological framework that the Sumerians used to understand their world. The term Anunnaki itself, despite widespread modern misinterpretation, derives from Sumerian linguistic elements meaning princely seed or offspring of En, referring to their status as descendants of En, the sky god. Every reputable Sumerian lexicon, every scholar who has devoted their career to this language, confirms this etymology. They were called Anunnaki because they were the divine children of heaven, born into the cosmic order rather than arriving from outside it. But here's what makes this topic so compelling and worth exploring in depth. The era during which the Anunnaki rose to prominence in Sumerian religion and mythology coincides exactly with the period when Earth, or more specifically, the region of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, underwent the most dramatic transformation in human history. This was when nomadic hunter-gatherers became settled agriculturalists, when scattered villages grew into the world's first cities, when simple subsistence living gave way to complex societies with specialized labor, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, social hierarchies, written laws, and organized religion. The Sumerian tablets describe this transformation not as a purely human achievement, not as a gradual evolutionary development, but as a period of intense divine activity when the Anunnaki and other gods actively shaped the earth and guided humanity toward civilization. Let's begin by establishing the timeline and context. The Sumerian civilization emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in the flat alluvial plains where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers deposited rich silt during their annual floods. This region, despite being hot, relatively dry, and lacking in natural resources like stone, timber, or metal ore, became the cradle of the world's first urban civilization. Archaeological evidence traces the development of Sumerian culture from the Ubaid period, around 5500 BCE, through the Uruk period beginning around 4000 BCE. When we see the emergence of true cities, monumental temples, complex economic systems, and ultimately, around 3200 BCE, the invention of writing. The earliest written texts we possess are Sumerian, making this language and culture our first window into how humans recorded their understanding of the world. The tablets that discuss the Anunnaki come primarily from the early dynastic period through the Ur-III period, roughly 2900 to 2000 BCE, though they preserve much older oral traditions that extend back into the preliterate past. These texts describe a cosmological framework in which the Anunnaki occupied a specific and crucial position. They were not the primordial creators. That role belonged to earlier deities like Namu, the primordial sea, and the first generation of gods including in heaven, Kai earth, and Enlil air. The Anunnaki belonged to later generations, born after the basic structure of the cosmos had been established, after heaven and earth had been separated, after the fundamental patterns of existence had been set in motion. The texts preserved in temple archives and later copied by generations of scribes describe the Anunnaki as performing several crucial functions in the cosmic order. First and foremost, they served as judges, particularly judges of the dead who sat in assembly in the underworld to determine the fate of souls who had departed the world of the living. This judicial role appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature, most famously in the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, where the Anunnaki are described as the 7 judges who fasten their eyes of death upon the goddess and condemn her to hang as a corpse in the realm of the dead. This is a far cry from the modern interpretation of them as spacefaring technologists, but it reveals something profound about how the Sumerians understood divine authority and the boundaries between life and death. But the Anunnaki had another role that's equally important for understanding how the Sumerians conceived of Earth's transformation during this period. They were described as divine laborers, members of the younger generation of gods who performed the backbreaking work of creation and cosmic maintenance. Several texts, particularly the composition known as Atrahasis in its later Akkadian version but based on older Sumerian traditions, describe a time when the Anunnaki bore the burden of agricultural labor, digging irrigation canals, clearing fields, piling up earth to create the raised platforms on which temples and cities would be built. This work was exhausting, the texts tell us. The gods complained bitterly about their toil, about the endless labor that left them miserable and resentful. Here's where the story becomes fascinating and reveals how the Sumerians understood the transformation of their landscape. The texts describe Earth during this early period as wild and undeveloped, lacking the infrastructure of civilization. The great rivers flowed, but their waters ran uselessly to the sea without being channeled through canals to irrigate fields. The land was fertile potentially, but it lay uncultivated, producing only wild grasses and reeds. There were no cities, no temples rising toward heaven, no ordered spaces where divine and human realms could intersect. The Anunnaki, according to these narratives, were tasked with transforming this raw, primordial landscape into something ordered and productive. They dug the first canals, establishing the irrigation systems that would make agriculture possible in a region that received insufficient rainfall for farming. They defined the courses of rivers, controlling the chaotic flood waters and directing them into useful channels. They cleared land, removing wild vegetation and preparing fields for cultivation. This mythological description corresponds remarkably well with what archaeologists have discovered about the actual transformation of the Mesopotamian landscape during the period when Sumerian civilization emerged. The development of irrigation agriculture was absolutely fundamental to urban civilization in this region. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile flooded predictably and farmers could rely on natural irrigation, Mesopotamia required active human intervention to make the land productive. Canals had to be dug, maintained, and regulated. Water had to be distributed fairly among different users. Complex social organization was necessary to coordinate these massive hydraulic projects that no individual family or small village could accomplish alone. The mythology of divine laborers transforming the earth through irrigation and agriculture preserved the memory of this crucial period of environmental modification, elevated to cosmic significance. But then comes the pivotal moment in the narrative that explains both the creation of humanity and the next phase of Earth's transformation. The Anunnaki, exhausted by their labor and resentful of their burden, rebelled. The texts describe this divine strike vividly. The gods refused to continue their work, complaining to the senior deities that the toil was unbearable. They gathered at the house of Enlil, the powerful god who oversaw the earth, and they burned their tools in protest, declaring they would work no more. This crisis threatened the entire cosmic order. If the divine laborers stopped maintaining the irrigation systems, the fields would become barren. If they ceased their work of organizing and ordering the landscape, chaos would return. The solution, according to the texts, came from Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and creative problem-solving. He proposed creating a substitute workforce, beings who would relieve the gods of their labor while allowing the essential work of maintaining civilization to continue. Working with the birth goddess Ninmah, also known as Ninhursag, Enki fashioned the first humans from clay mixed with the essence of divine being. The texts describe this process in various ways across different compositions, but the fundamental concept remains consistent. Humanity was created for a specific purpose, to perform the agricultural labor that the gods found burdensome, to maintain the infrastructure of civilization, to serve the divine realm through their toil. This creation narrative has profound implications for understanding how the Sumerians viewed the transformation of Earth during what we might call the Anunnaki era. With humanity's creation, a new phase of development began. Humans, unlike the gods, were mortal, limited in power, but sufficiently intelligent and capable to perform complex agricultural work. They could dig irrigation ditches, plant and harvest crops, tend flocks and herds, construct buildings, and maintain temples. Most importantly, they could reproduce, creating new generations of workers without requiring divine intervention for each individual creation. The texts describe the early period of human existence as one of close collaboration between the divine and mortal realms. The Anunnaki and other gods taught humans the fundamental techniques of civilization. They revealed the secrets of agriculture, when to plant, how to irrigate, which crops to cultivate. They showed humans how to domesticate animals, transforming wild sheep and goats and cattle into managed flocks that provided meat, milk, leather, and wool. They instructed humans in construction techniques, how to make mud bricks from the abundant clay, how to build structures that would withstand the harsh environment, how to create the raised platforms on which temples would stand above the flood waters. A composition known as Enki and the World Order, preserved in multiple copies from various Sumerian cities, provides extraordinary detail about how the gods organized Earth during this transformative period. Enki, described as traveling across the land and surveying creation, assigned different deities to oversee specific aspects of the natural and civilized world. One god was given responsibility for ensuring that fresh water flowed from springs and rivers. Another oversaw grain agriculture, making sure that fields produced their yields in proper seasons. Yet another managed livestock, ensuring that herds multiplied and thrived. Gods were assigned to oversee construction, weaving, metalwork, brewing, and countless other activities that characterized civilized life. This theological framework, divine specialization and bureaucratic organization of cosmic responsibilities, reflected and legitimized the increasing specialization and complexity of actual Sumerian society. As cities grew larger and more sophisticated, as populations increased and economic systems became more elaborate, the mythology evolved to describe divine oversight of these same developments. The gods weren't absent landlords who created the world and then withdrew. They were actively involved in maintaining cosmic and social order, continuously engaged with the processes that kept civilization functioning. But here's a crucial aspect of the transformation that occurred during this period that the tablets emphasize repeatedly. The relationship between the divine and mortal realms was reciprocal and mutually dependent, not simply exploitative. Yes, humans worked to serve the gods, providing them with offerings and maintaining their temples. But the gods also worked to serve humanity, ensuring that the natural systems functioned properly, that rains came in their season, that rivers flowed but didn't flood catastrophically, that crops grew and animals multiplied. This reciprocity was enacted through ritual, particularly through the daily cult that was performed in temples throughout the Sumerian world. Every major city had a temple dedicated to its patron deity, and these temples were understood as the literal households of the gods. The central cult statue, often made of precious materials and standing in the innermost sanctuary, was not merely a representation of the deity but the actual dwelling place of divine presence. Priests and priestesses cared for this statue with extraordinary attention, treating it as a living being. Each morning the god was awakened with hymns, washed, dressed in fine linens, anointed with sweet-smelling oils and presented with elaborate meals. These offerings, bread, beer, meat, fruits, dates, and other delicacies, were understood to nourish the god, providing sustenance for divine existence in the mortal realm. The reciprocal nature of this relationship becomes clear when we examine what happened to these offerings after the god had consumed their spiritual essence. The physical food was redistributed to temple personnel, dependents, and sometimes the broader community, creating an economic system in which religious devotion and practical sustenance were inseparably linked. The temple wasn't just a religious institution separate from economic life. It was the primary economic institution in early Sumerian cities, managing vast agricultural estates, employing hundreds or thousands of workers, accumulating surpluses, and redistributing resources according to complex hierarchical principles. The transformation of Earth during the Anunnaki era, therefore, wasn't merely environmental or technological. It was fundamentally social and organizational. The tablets describe the establishment of kingship as a divine institution that descended from heaven to organize human society. The Sumerian king list, that fascinating document we examined earlier, states explicitly, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This wasn't describing a literal physical descent, but expressing a theological principle. Political authority had divine origins and divine sanction. The king ruled not through personal charisma or military might alone, though both were certainly important in practice, but as the representative of the divine realm in human affairs, chosen by the gods to maintain order and ensure that civilization functioned according to divine design. The antediluvian cities mentioned in the king list, Eridu, Bad-Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, represented in Sumerian mythological thinking the first implementation of this divine blueprint for civilization. These cities, ruled by kings who reigned for impossibly long periods measured in thousands of years, existed in a liminal time between pure myth and recognizable history. They were the prototypes, the original examples of urban life under direct divine supervision. Archaeological excavations have confirmed that several of these cities, particularly Eridu and Shuruppak, were indeed among the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers extending back into the 6th millennium BCE, long before writing was invented to record their histories. Eridu holds special significance in understanding Earth's transformation during this period. The city was sacred to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and his temple there bore the name Iabzu, meaning house of the cosmic deep. This wasn't poetic metaphor. The temple was believed to be built upon the very spot where the primordial waters of the Abzu, the subterranean cosmic ocean, broke through to the surface world. When archaeologists excavated Eridu in the 1940s and 1950s, they discovered a sequence of temples built one atop another, extending back to approximately 5400 BCE. The earliest structure was a tiny chapel, perhaps only a few meters square, but even this modest building stood on a raised platform and was oriented with careful attention to cardinal directions. Over centuries and millennia, successive generations built larger and more elaborate temples on the same sacred spot, each new structure respecting the orientation and location of its predecessors. This archaeological sequence provides tangible evidence of the transformation the tablets describe. The earliest temple at Eridu dates to a period when the settlement was a small village of perhaps a few hundred people living in reed huts, practicing simple agriculture and fishing. By the time writing was invented several thousand years later, Eridu had grown into a major city with monumental temples, complex social hierarchies, long-distance trade networks, and all the characteristics of urban civilization. The mythology of the Anunnaki and other gods transforming the earth, establishing order, teaching humans the techniques of civilization. All this narrative corresponds to a real historical process of extraordinary social, technological, and environmental change. But the tablets also describe tensions and conflicts that arose as this transformation progressed, and these mythological narratives reveal sophisticated thinking about the unintended consequences of civilizational development. One of the most important texts for understanding this theme is the flood narrative, preserved in multiple versions across Sumerian and later Akkadian literature. The story, in its various tellings, describes a time when humanity had multiplied successfully across the land, filling the cities with their activity and agricultural labor. They prospered under divine protection, engaging in all the pursuits of civilized life, farming, building, trading, reproducing. But their very success created a problem that threatened the cosmic order. The noise of human civilization, the constant tumult of crowded cities full of people going about their business, disturbed the gods who dwelt in temples and celestial palaces. Enlil, the powerful god of air and storms who held supreme authority over the earth, found himself unable to sleep because of the clamor rising from human settlements. This detail appears across multiple versions of the story and is absolutely crucial for understanding Sumerian theology and how they conceived of the relationship between civilization and the divine realm. The gods didn't decide to destroy humanity because humans were evil or sinful in a moral sense, because they had violated divine commandments or committed terrible crimes. The motivation was much more mundane and in some ways more disturbing. Humans were too numerous, too successful, too vibrant with life and activity. They filled the world with noise that kept the gods awake and disturbed divine tranquility. After consulting with other senior deities, Enlil made the catastrophic decision to destroy humanity with a great flood that would sweep over the land, wiping away the cities and their noisy inhabitants, returning the world to the quiet primordial state it had enjoyed before humans multiplied so abundantly. This represents a profound crisis in the relationship between divine and mortal realms. The transformation that the gods had initiated, creating humans to perform labor, teaching them civilization, establishing cities and agricultural systems, had been too successful. Humanity had fulfilled their purpose so well that they became a problem rather than a solution. But one god disagreed with the decision to annihilate humanity completely. Enki, who had played a key role in humanity's creation, and who appears throughout Sumerian literature as more sympathetic to humans than his fellow deities, believed that total destruction was excessive punishment for the crime of being too numerous and noisy. He recognized that humans served useful purposes, maintaining the infrastructure of civilization, making offerings that sustained divine existence in the mortal realm. Eliminating them entirely would force the gods back to the very labor problem that had motivated human creation in the first place. The texts portray Enki as working around the edges of Enlil's decree, finding loopholes, using his characteristic cleverness to achieve his goals without directly defying divine law. He appeared to Ziusudra in the Sumerian version or Atrahasis in the Akkadian version, warning this righteous king that a flood was coming and instructing him to build a great boat to save himself, his family, and representatives of all living species. The text provides specifications about the vessel's construction, details about dimensions, materials, and waterproofing techniques that reveal practical knowledge of boat-building technology even as they're embedded in mythological narrative. When the flood arrived, it came with terrifying violence. The texts describe all the winds gathering together from every direction, converging into a single catastrophic storm. For 7 days and 7 nights, the deluge continued without pause. The cities that humanity had built with such tremendous effort over generations, those centers of civilization, where temples rose toward heaven and markets bustled with trade and scribes recorded transactions in newly invented writing, were submerged and destroyed. The ordered landscape of irrigation canals and cultivated fields, of raised platforms and monumental architecture, was temporarily undone, returned to the primordial state of chaos and undifferentiated waters that had existed before the transformation began. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating context for this mythological catastrophe. Excavations at several Mesopotamian sites, including Shuruppak, the city where Ziusudra ruled according to the myth, Kish and have revealed substantial flood deposits dating to approximately 2900 BCE. These aren't evidence of a worldwide deluge. The flood layers are geographically limited to the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and don't appear at all sites even within Mesopotamia. But for the people who experienced these catastrophic floods, who watched the rivers overflow their banks and spread across the flat plains for miles, who saw their familiar landscape disappear underwater, these events would have seemed genuinely world-ending. The Mesopotamian plain was effectively their entire world, and when it flooded so completely that only the raised tells where cities stood remained above water, this was an apocalypse in the truest sense. The flood narrative describes Earth undergoing a temporary reversal of the transformation that had occurred during the Anunnaki era. Civilization was stripped away. The infrastructure of canals and fields was destroyed. Cities were abandoned as their populations drowned or fled. The land returned to a wild state, no longer organized and productive but chaotic and deadly. This mythological event preserved traumatic memories of real historical floods while elevating them to cosmic and theological significance, making them moments when the gods intervened directly to reset the terms of their relationship with humanity. When the flood waters finally receded and Ziusudra emerged from his boat, his first action was to perform sacrifices to the gods, butchering oxen and sheep, presenting bread and drink offerings, burning fragrant juniper whose smoke rose toward heaven. The gods, the text tells us, gathered around the sacrifice like flies, drawn by the sweet savor of offerings they had been deprived of during the flood when all humanity except Ziusudra's family had perished. This detail reveals something profound about the theological framework. The gods needed humans just as humans needed gods. Without humans to make offerings, to maintain temples, to perform the rituals that sustained divine presence in the mortal realm, the gods suffered privation. The resolution of the flood crisis involved negotiation and compromise among the gods. Enlil discovered that humans had survived his attempted genocide, that his decree had been subverted by Enki's intervention, and he was furious. But eventually, through divine debate, they reached an accommodation. Humanity could continue to exist, but measures would be implemented to control their population and reduce the noise that had so disturbed Enlil. Various texts suggest different population control mechanisms were instituted at this point. Mortality became an absolute and unavoidable condition, with fixed lifespans measured in decades rather than the thousands of years antediluvian rulers had enjoyed. Women's fertility was regulated through barrenness for some and infant mortality. Wild animals and diseases were introduced as additional checks on human population growth. The post-flood world, according to the tablets, represented a new phase in Earth's history, a period when the basic structure of civilization had been firmly established, but the relationship between divine and human realms had been recalibrated. Humanity would continue to transform the landscape, to build cities and dig canals and cultivate fields, but always within limits, always conscious of divine authority and divine prerogatives. The texts describe this period as one of increasingly sophisticated civilizational development. New cities were founded, technologies advanced, trade networks expanded, bringing copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from the Levanten Mountains, precious stones and exotic goods from distant regions. The Anunnaki, in their role as determiners of fate and judges of the dead, became increasingly important in this post-flood world. Sumerian literature from the early dynastic and Ur-III periods frequently mentions the Anunnaki in contexts of judgment and destiny. They appear in royal inscriptions, where kings claim to have been chosen by the Anunnaki to rule. They appear in legal contexts where oaths are sworn by the Anunnaki as witnesses and guarantors. They appear in funerary texts describing the journey of the soul to the underworld, where the Anunnaki sit in assembly to judge the dead and assign them their eternal dwelling place. This judicial function reflects sophisticated thinking about order, justice, and the boundaries that structure existence. The Anunnaki, as judges, maintain the fundamental boundary between life and death, ensuring that all mortals eventually cross that threshold regardless of their earthly status or achievements. Kings and slaves, rich and poor, powerful and weak, all would stand before the Anunnaki's judgment. This theological principle enforced a kind of cosmic equality that transcended earthly hierarchies, a recognition that human power and status were temporary and limited, meaningful only within the mortal realm and subject always to divine authority. The transformation of Earth during the Anunnaki era, as the tablets describe it, was therefore multidimensional, environmental, social, technological, and spiritual. The wild landscape was made productive through irrigation and agriculture. Scattered villages grew into the world's first cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Simple subsistence economies gave way to complex systems with specialized labor, long-distance trade, and accumulation of wealth. Oral traditions were supplemented and eventually replaced by written records that allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across generations with unprecedented accuracy. Political authority was centralized under divine kingship that organized large-scale cooperative projects. Religious institutions developed elaborate ritual systems that structured time and space and defined relationships between divine and human realms. But perhaps most profound was the psychological and philosophical transformation that occurred during this period. Humans moved from seeing themselves as part of the natural world, subject to its rhythms and forces, to seeing themselves as shapers of that world, capable of imposing their will on the environment through technology and organization. Yet simultaneously, Sumerian theology insisted that this power was derivative and limited, granted by the gods and subject to divine oversight and divine judgment. Humans could transform the earth, but only within the framework that the gods had established, only while maintaining the reciprocal obligations that bound mortal to divine. This tension between human agency and divine authority, between the transformative power of civilization and the absolute boundaries set by cosmic order, runs through all of Sumerian literature. It appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that great masterpiece of ancient literature, where the hero king transforms his city with magnificent building projects, but ultimately fails in his quest to escape mortality and must accept the human condition of limited existence. It appears in myths like Inanna's descent to the underworld, where even a great goddess must submit to the Anunnaki's judgment when she enters their domain. It appears in wisdom literature and proverbs that counsel acceptance of one's lot while encouraging excellence in one's appointed role. The archaeological record confirms the extraordinary transformation that occurred during the period the myths describe. The Uruk period, named after the great city that reached its height around 3200 BCE, saw revolutionary changes in settlement patterns, with populations concentrating in large urban centers rather than dispersed villages. The Ina precinct in Uruk, sacred to the goddess Inanna, featured massive temple complexes built on raised platforms, requiring the organization of thousands of workers and the accumulation of tremendous resources. The limestone temple, the mosaic temple, and the pillared hall demonstrated architectural sophistication and aesthetic ambition far beyond anything that had come before. The invention of writing around 3200 BCE represents perhaps the single most significant innovation of the Anunnaki era, as the tablets describe it. Writing began as an administrative tool, a technology for tracking economic transactions in the increasingly complex temple economies. But it quickly expanded to record everything: royal inscriptions commemorating building projects and military victories, legal codes establishing rules for property, commerce, and personal conduct, literary compositions including myths, hymns, and wisdom texts, mathematical and astronomical observations, medical and magical incantations, letters exchanged between rulers or family members. Writing transformed human cognition itself, allowing abstract thought to be preserved, compared, analyzed, and built upon across generations in ways that purely oral cultures could never achieve. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. Early Sumerian cities developed sophisticated systems for managing agricultural production, allocating labor, distributing rations, and tracking surpluses. Tens of thousands of clay tablets from temple and palace archives document these economic activities in extraordinary detail. Deliveries of grain from specific fields, distributions of bread and beer rations to named workers, inventories of livestock and tools, accounts of trade expeditions to distant lands. These records reveal economies operating at scales that required literacy and numeracy, institutional structures, and concepts of property and contract that were revolutionary innovations in human history. But we must be careful not to romanticize this transformation or see it as purely positive progress. The concentration of wealth and power in urban centers created stark inequalities that didn't exist in smaller-scale societies. The labor required to build massive temples and irrigation systems was backbreaking and sometimes coerced. Women's status may have declined as societies became more complex and hierarchical. Warfare between competing city-states became more organized and destructive. Environmental degradation began as intensive irrigation led to soil salinization that gradually reduced agricultural productivity in southern Mesopotamia. The tablets themselves, in their more reflective moments, acknowledge these costs and tensions. The Anunnaki, in the theological framework the tablets present, were both agents of this transformation and enforcers of the boundaries it could not cross. As judges and determiners of fate, they reminded humans that civilizational achievement, however impressive, could not overcome fundamental cosmic limits. Cities might rise toward heaven, but humans could never actually reach the divine realm and claim equality with the gods. Agricultural surplus might accumulate, but death would eventually claim every mortal regardless of their wealth or power. Writing might preserve knowledge and memory, but it couldn't grant the kind of eternal existence that the gods enjoyed. The era of the Anunnaki, as described in the tablets, was therefore a period of profound transformation tempered by enduring limits, of human achievement enabled by divine gift, but constrained by cosmic order. It was the time when Earth changed from a wild landscape to a civilized one, when humans evolved from simple farmers to urban dwellers capable of extraordinary collective achievements. But it was also the time when the fundamental terms of human existence were established: mortality, hierarchy, toil, submission to divine authority. That would define the human condition for all subsequent generations. Modern scholarship continues to refine our understanding of this transformative period by combining textual analysis with archaeological evidence, environmental studies, and comparative anthropology. We now know that the development of Sumerian civilization wasn't inevitable or unique. Similar processes of urbanization and state formation occurred independently in Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. But Mesopotamia was first, or at least among the very first, and the tablets these early civilizations left behind provide our earliest written window into how humans understood and mythologized this transformation. The legacy of the Anunnaki era, as the Sumerians conceived it, extended far beyond ancient Mesopotamia itself. Later Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations inherited and adapted Sumerian mythology, maintaining the Anunnaki as important deities while integrating them into evolving theological frameworks. Elements of Sumerian cosmology and mythology influenced the religious traditions of neighboring peoples: Canaanites, Israelites, Phoenicians, and through various channels contributed to the religious and philosophical heritage of the broader ancient Near East and eventually Western civilization. The flood narrative, in particular, shows remarkable persistence and adaptation across cultures and millennia, appearing in modified forms in the biblical story of Noah, in Greek myths about Deucalion and Pyrrha, and in flood traditions from around the world. While modern scientific understanding of geology and hydrology makes clear that these stories don't describe a single worldwide deluge, they preserve authentic memories of catastrophic regional floods that traumatized ancient communities and required mythological explanation. The Sumerian version remains our earliest written account of this universal human experience of natural disaster and survival. What the tablets reveal, ultimately, is that the Anunnaki were neither alien visitors nor primitive superstitions, but sophisticated theological concepts embedded in a complex mythological framework that ancient people used to understand their world and their place in it. They were divine judges who enforced cosmic boundaries, divine laborers who transformed chaotic nature into ordered civilization, divine witnesses to human achievement and human limitation. The era during which they figured most prominently in Sumerian religion corresponds exactly to the period when Earth underwent its most dramatic transformation, not through extraterrestrial intervention or advanced ancient technology, but through the hard work of countless humans digging canals, planting fields, building cities, developing technologies, creating institutions, and gradually, through trial and error over many centuries, inventing civilization itself. The transformation wasn't sudden or miraculous. It was incremental, cumulative, building on the achievements of previous generations, spreading through cultural contact and trade, sometimes advancing rapidly and sometimes stagnating or regressing. But the end result, visible in the archaeological remains of Sumerian cities and tangible in the thousands of clay tablets they left behind, was nothing short of revolutionary: the birth of urban civilization, the invention of writing, the establishment of institutional religion, the development of complex economics, the creation of monumental architecture, the codification of law, the composition of literature, and the recording of history. The tablets tell us that the Sumerians attributed these achievements not to purely human ingenuity, but to divine instruction and divine favor, to the gifts that the Anunnaki and other gods bestowed upon humanity. This wasn't false modesty or primitive superstition. It was a sophisticated recognition that civilization depends on accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations, on cultural inheritance that each generation receives as a gift from ancestors, and has responsibility to preserve and enhance for descendants. By attributing civilization's foundations to divine origins, the Sumerians were marking these achievements as sacred, protecting them from casual abandonment, emphasizing their fundamental importance for human flourishing. The inquiry does not begin with a moment of invention so much as with a quiet arrival. The earliest tablets recovered from the Ina precinct at Uruk do not behave like tentative experiments. They enter the archaeological record already burdened with responsibility. They count barley and sheep, record deliveries, mark rations owed and received. Their surfaces are ruled with purpose, their signs arranged in consistent order, their numerical systems already separated by commodity. Nothing in their physical form suggests hesitation. Writing appears not as a fragile idea, but as a working instrument placed into service. These tablets, dated roughly between 3400 and 3200 BCE, belong to what scholars call the Uruk IV and III phases. They are thick, palm-sized clay rectangles, impressed while wet, baked accidentally by fire or intentionally by time. The signs pressed into them are not letters and not yet words. They are images reduced to function. A jar no longer looks like a jar. A head no longer resembles a head. Each sign has already been stripped of its pictorial excess and pressed into a narrow administrative role. The reduction itself implies a prior familiarity with use. Someone had already learned what could be discarded. What is absent is as telling as what remains. There are no tablets that explain how to write, no corrections scratched out, no marginal attempts, no visible stages of trial. The tablets arrive standardized in size and format, with numerical notations separated from lexical signs in consistent positions. Even the direction of writing, top to bottom, left to right, appears fixed. Such regularity suggests that writing entered the record after a period of formation that is not preserved, or perhaps was never treated as an innovation worth narrating. The earliest tablets are overwhelmingly administrative. They do not record myths, prayers, or royal boasts. They manage goods. Barley is counted in one system, livestock in another, labor in another still. The scribe knew which numerical base applied before touching the clay. This implies instruction, but the archaeological layers reveal no transitional debris of teaching. Scribal schools appear later. Here, the act of writing seems already embedded within an institutional environment that expected it. Archaeologists have long noted the association between these tablets and bevel-rim bowls, mass-produced ceramic vessels found by the thousands in Uruk contexts. The bowls are uniform, stackable, and imprecise in finish. They appear to have functioned as ration containers. The tablets that accompany them record distributions, grain issued, labor performed, days counted. The writing and the object speak the same administrative language. Neither explains the other. Both assume a system already agreed upon. The signs themselves are not purely local. Some correspond to objects not commonly excavated at Uruk, implying categories broader than immediate surroundings. Others represent offices rather than things, roles, not materials. A sign for administrator appears early, already abstracted. Writing does not begin with naming the world. It begins with managing it. That choice reflects priorities older than the tablets themselves. The absence of personal names in the earliest phase is notable. Individuals are not yet recorded as actors. Instead, offices and institutions receive and distribute. Temples appear not as religious spaces but as accounting centers. The writing does not describe belief. It enforces obligation. Such a system suggests continuity with an earlier mode of organization, one in which authority was already impersonal and procedural. There is also the matter of language. The signs do not yet encode spoken Sumerian in full. They bypass grammar. Verbs are rare. The tablets function without sentences. This is not illiteracy, it is selectivity. Writing does not attempt to mirror speech. It captures only what administration requires. The choice to exclude speech implies confidence that speech does not need preservation. Only transactions do. Some tablets bear sealing impressions, rolled cylinder seals that identify offices or institutions rather than individuals. The seals themselves depict scenes of presentation and hierarchy, repeated with minimal variation. The imagery, like the writing, appears canonical. No artist signs them. No scribe marks authorship. Authority resides elsewhere, unnamed but assumed. When later lexical lists appear, tablets that categorize animals, professions, cities, they do not read like inventions. They read like inventories brought into written form. The world had already been sorted. Writing arrives to store the sorting. This is not the behavior of a society discovering order. It is the behavior of one preserving it. Even the clay tablets' durability may be incidental. Many were never meant to last. They were temporary records, archived briefly, then discarded. That thousands survived is an accident of destruction and burial. Writing, at this stage, was not about memory for future generations. It was about continuity from one accounting period to the next. Memory already existed elsewhere. Within later Sumerian tradition, writing is attributed to divine origin. The god Nisaba is described not as an inventor but as a keeper of records. Her domain is the tablet house, the archive, the measure. The language used in hymns suggests stewardship rather than creation. Writing is something guarded, not discovered. Such descriptions reflect how scribes understood their craft centuries later, looking backward at its beginning as something received. If writing enters the archaeological record already disciplined, already constrained, already bureaucratic, then the moment of its appearance may not represent a beginning at all. It may represent a transfer, from practice to artifact, from memory to clay. The tablets do not announce themselves. They assume authority. They do not argue for their necessity. They operate as if the world already requires them. If writing was not introduced as an experiment but deployed as a tool within an existing order, then one might ask where that order located its source of legitimacy, and whether the tablets were recording the start of authority or merely its continuation under new hands. If authority could be continued rather than created, then it would need a record capable of stretching backward beyond living memory. The Sumerian king list performs this task with a calm assurance that does not explain itself. Preserved on multiple tablets and prisms, copied and recopied across centuries, it does not begin with a founding council or an election. It begins with a statement of transfer. Kingship, it says, was lowered from heaven. The phrasing is administrative, not poetic. The verb used implies placement, as one sets an object in a prepared location. Kingship is treated as an office that exists independently of its holders. It moves, it rests, it is taken up and later removed. The list is concerned less with personalities than with continuity. Names appear, but the institution precedes them. Authority arrives already formed. The pre-flood section of the list is striking for its scale and restraint. 8 kings rule 5 cities. Their reigns last tens of thousands of years. The list offers no justification for these numbers. It does not defend them, explain them, or embellish them. They are recorded in the same tone as later reigns measured in decades. The scribes did not flag this portion as symbolic or exceptional. It is entered as data. Cities appear before dynasties. Eridu, Bad-Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak are named as seats of rule before any human lineage is established. Kingship is shown moving from city to city, as if the cities themselves were prepared to receive it. This movement suggests a framework older than the rulers. The city does not grow around the king. The king is placed within the city. The list does not claim that these early kings founded their cities. It assumes the cities already exist, nor does it describe acts of conquest or innovation. It records tenure. When one king's reign ends, kingship moves on. The mechanism of transfer is not described. The silence implies familiarity. The scribes expected their audience to understand how such movement occurred. After the flood, the list changes in tone but not in structure. Kingship again descends, again settles in a city, again produces rulers with defined reigns. The flood interrupts, but it does not reset. The list treats the post-flood era as a continuation of the same system under altered conditions. The format remains intact. Authority persists, even when its carriers change. The list was not a neutral chronicle. It was a political document used to legitimize contemporary dynasties by placing them within an unbroken chain. Yet its power depends on accepting the pre-flood section as meaningful. If that section were dismissed, the continuity would collapse. The scribes preserved it because their argument required it. Variants of the king list reveal careful curation rather than blind copying. Some cities are emphasized, others minimized. Some dynasties are expanded, others compressed. Yet the opening claim remains stable. Kingship always comes from above. No version begins with human agreement. This consistency suggests that the idea of external origin was not negotiable. In administrative terms, kingship resembles a resource allocated and withdrawn. It is not owned, it is held. The list records reigns as durations of stewardship. Even powerful kings appear as temporary occupants of an office that outlasts them. Their achievements are irrelevant to the document. What matters is sequence. The Anunnaki are not named in the king list, yet later texts associate them with the granting of authority. The absence here is notable. The list does not explain who lowered kingship or why. It records the fact as procedural. The source of authority remains outside the document, beyond inquiry. This distance gives the list its stability. For those who copied the king list centuries later, the pre-flood kings were not ancestors in a biological sense. They were predecessors in office. The list does not invite identification. It invites compliance. By aligning oneself with the list, a ruler aligns with a system that predates humanity as it is currently known. The king list does not argue that civilization was invented. It suggests that governance was resumed. The flood becomes a moment of disruption, not origin. Kingship returns because it was already there to return. The list preserves this idea without comment, as if explanation would weaken it. If authority was understood as something inherited rather than created, and if its origin lay beyond human initiative, then the list functions as more than history. It becomes an administrative memory of a prior order. And if kingship could be lowered once and raised again, one might ask whether the cities that received it were merely rebuilt, or whether they were remembering something they had already been prepared to hold. If kingship could be placed into cities as something already prepared to receive it, then the cities themselves invite closer attention. The earliest urban centers of southern Mesopotamia do not describe their beginnings as acts of human decision. Their own records speak with a different emphasis. In foundation inscriptions, hymns, and dedicatory texts, cities present themselves not as new constructions, but as restorations of something older, aligned to plans that predate the rulers who claim them. Eridu offers the clearest example. Archaeologically, it sits atop a long sequence of occupation, with temple levels stacked one upon another, each rebuilt directly over the last. Yet the textual memory of Eridu does not celebrate this gradual accumulation. Instead, it names the city as the first. Later compositions refer to it as a place where the plans were perfected, language that implies completion rather than experimentation. The earliest temple, dedicated to Enki, is described not as an inaugural structure but as a rightful placement, positioned where it was meant to stand. Foundation cones and bricks from later periods reinforce this posture. Kings who rebuild temples in Eridu do not claim to improve them. They claim to restore correct dimensions, to realign walls that had drifted, to return the structure to an earlier specification. Measurements are treated as authoritative, not flexible. The ground itself appears to remember where the building belongs. The builder's role is custodial. Nippur presents a similar pattern, though its political status differs. As a religious center rather than a royal capital, Nippur was rarely ruled directly, yet it held authority over legitimacy. Inscriptions describe it as the place where destinies are decreed, a formulation that places decision-making beyond any single reign. Excavation of the Ekkur temple complex reveals repeated rebuilding phases that preserve orientation and footprint with remarkable consistency. Even after destruction, the plan returns. What is notable is how little explanation accompanies these acts. Texts do not describe debates over layout or innovation in design. They speak of laying foundations in terms that suggest reactivation rather than creation. The foundation deposit itself, often including figurines, inscribed tablets, or symbolic objects, is buried not as a marker of novelty, but as an acknowledgement of continuity with what lies beneath. Later and more visibly monumental, preserves this same language. Royal inscriptions from the 3rd dynasty of speak of restoring temples as they were in ancient times. The phrase does not specify a date. Ancient is not defined. It functions as an accepted category, one that does not require elaboration. The city's ziggurat, rebuilt multiple times, adheres to a stable orientation and proportional logic that survives political collapse. Builders changed, but the plan endured. Archaeologically, this persistence is visible in the alignment of streets, the placement of sacred precincts, and the repetition of boundary markers. Flood deposits and destruction layers interrupt occupation, yet the rebuilt city follows the same internal logic. The urban fabric reasserts itself. This behavior suggests that cities were not treated as adaptable spaces, but as fixed diagrams anchored to remembered order. Texts reinforce this impression. City hymns describe urban centers as having been named before being inhabited. Naming here functions as designation, not description. The city is assigned a role within a larger system. Walls, gates, and temples are enumerated as elements of an existing whole. The human role is to occupy, maintain, and occasionally repair. The Anunnaki appear in these contexts as guarantors of placement rather than builders. They are associated with decreeing locations, establishing boundaries, and assigning functions. They do not lay bricks. They authorize ground. Their presence in foundation narratives is indirect, embedded in language that treats the city as already accounted for in a broader order. Urban archaeology often looks for signs of growth, irregularity, adaptation, improvisation. Yet in these cities, the earliest levels already exhibit formal planning. Streets are aligned, districts are differentiated, sacred and administrative spaces are separated. Such organization does not announce itself as new. It appears already normalized. Even practical infrastructure reflects this attitude. Canals are repeatedly dredged along the same courses. When rerouted, inscriptions describe the act as correction rather than change. Water, like authority, follows established paths. Deviations are temporary. The builders who left these records did not see themselves as founders. They positioned themselves as caretakers of cities whose significance extended backward beyond their own lineage. Their inscriptions anchor legitimacy not in innovation, but in fidelity. To build correctly was to remember correctly. If cities were understood as restorations of prior arrangements rather than inventions of the present, then the question shifts from who built them to how their plans were preserved. And if urban space itself functioned as a kind of record, holding proportions and orientations across centuries of disruption, then one might ask where the language came from that allowed such memory to be maintained with so little need for explanation. If cities could hold memory in their measurements, then the language used to describe those cities carries another layer of preservation. The verbs chosen by Sumerian scribes do not merely narrate events, they encode assumptions about how order enters and leaves the world. In texts where the Anunnaki are mentioned, the language is careful, procedural, and notably restrained. What is described is not creation, but movement. Across administrative hymns, temple inscriptions, and cosmological accounts copied in scribal schools, certain verbs recur with consistency. Authority is said to come down, to be set in place, to be established, and later to be taken away. These are not verbs of making. They are verbs of transfer. The grammatical subject is often absent or implicit, as if the action itself mattered more than the actor. One frequently encountered verb conveys the act of lowering something from above. It is used for physical objects, such as standards or emblems, but also for abstract entities like kingship or divine ordinances. The same verb appears in texts describing ritual installations, where an object is placed into its correct position after having been absent. The implication is that the object already exists elsewhere. The action is relocation, not fabrication. Similarly, the language used for founding temples avoids terms that would suggest invention. Builders speak of setting foundations, of returning walls to their place, of re-establishing sacred precincts. When divine beings are associated with these acts, their role is linguistic rather than material. They decree placement. They do not design. The verbs reflect this division of responsibility. When the Anunnaki are named, they are most often linked to collective actions. They assemble, they decree, they withdraw. The texts do not dwell on their physical presence. Instead, absence is marked with equal clarity. Certain verbs describe departure in ways that suggest intentional removal rather than disappearance. Ordinances are said to be taken back. Authority is lifted. The world continues, but without direct supervision. This linguistic pattern is especially visible in flood-related compositions. The language does not describe the flood as an act of creation or destruction in absolute terms. It is framed as an interruption. The gods leave their seats. Decisions are suspended. Afterward, order is restored. The same verbs used for administrative reinstatement appear in these texts, blurring the boundary between cosmic and bureaucratic action. Sumerian grammar allows for precise expression of agency, yet scribes often choose constructions that obscure it. Passive forms and nominalized verbs are common when describing foundational events. Kingship is not said to be given by a named figure, but to have come down. Cities are not built by hands, but are established. The language directs attention away from originators and toward outcomes. This choice is not accidental. Scribal education emphasized correct usage over expressive freedom. Lexical lists paired verbs with expected contexts, reinforcing conventional associations. A verb meaning to set in place would appear alongside terms for temples, offices, and laws. Students learn not just vocabulary but worldview. Certain actions belong together. Certain processes were assumed. In this framework, the Anunnaki function linguistically as custodians of process. They authorize transitions. They are present at moments of placement and withdrawal, but absent from descriptions of daily operation. The world runs on established terms. Language mirrors this stability by favoring verbs that imply continuity. Even when new dynasties arise, the language remains unchanged. Inscriptions celebrating a king's accession use the same verbs applied to ancient predecessors. He does not invent his reign, he takes up kingship. When his rule ends, kingship moves on. The repetition reinforces the idea that authority is mobile but constant. What emerges from this linguistic landscape is a subtle but persistent orientation toward inheritance. Actions are framed as responses to prior conditions. The vocabulary does not support narratives of sudden origin. It supports maintenance. The scribes who chose these words were not speculating about beginnings. They were documenting procedures they believed to be older than themselves. If language itself preserves assumptions about how order enters and exits the human sphere, then the verbs chosen by Sumerian scribes become records of expectation. And if those expectations consistently describe descent and withdrawal rather than creation, one might ask how such linguistic habits shaped the way administration itself was first recorded in clay. If verbs could quietly establish expectations of continuity, then the tablets that put those verbs into practice reveal how deeply such expectations were embedded in daily governance. The earliest administrative records from southern Mesopotamia do not show an institution learning how to function. They show one already functioning, issuing instructions, receiving goods, and balancing accounts with little sign of hesitation. From the earliest Uruk period tablets, the layout is disciplined. Columns are ruled, totals are separated from entries. Numerical signs vary according to commodity, not convenience. Barley is counted one way, livestock another, labor days another still. This differentiation is not explained on the tablet. It is assumed. The scribe does not clarify which system is being used because the reader is expected to know. Ration lists are among the most common records. They specify amounts distributed to workers, dependents, and officials. The tablets rarely identify the reason for the distribution. They do not record negotiations or disputes. They simply state allocation. The absence of narrative suggests that the process itself was uncontested. The tablet's authority lay in its format, not its argument. Labor records exhibit the same confidence. Groups are listed by role rather than by individual name. Workdays are tallied. Absences are marked with standardized signs. There is no indication that these conventions were new. The scribes did not annotate their methods. They followed them. One striking feature of these early tablets is their economy of expression. Signs are minimal. Redundancy is avoided. The tablets do not attempt to be legible to outsiders. They serve an internal audience already trained to read them. This implies a prior period of instruction and agreement that is not visible in the archaeological record. The physical handling of the tablets reinforces this impression. Many show fingerprints where the clay was turned and impressed quickly. Corrections are rare. When they occur, they follow consistent methods such as smoothing and reimpressing a sign. This suggests procedural norms already established. Errors were addressed but not explained. Archives recovered from later periods preserve these early tablets alongside newer ones, treated as part of a continuous record. They were not discarded as obsolete experiments. They remained legible within the same administrative tradition. The system did not replace itself. It accumulated. The presence of seal impressions adds another layer. Seals identify offices, institutions, or officials, but not personal identity in the modern sense. The same seal could be used across years, even as personnel changed. Authority resided in the role, not the individual. The tablet recorded compliance with an office that existed beyond any one holder. There is little evidence of improvisation. Even when new commodities appear, they are integrated into existing numerical frameworks. The system expands without reconfiguration. This suggests that the logic governing administration was adaptable but stable, capable of absorbing change without questioning its own structure. The Anunnaki do not appear in these tablets by name, yet the administrative language aligns with texts that attribute order and measure to divine ordinance. Weights, measures, and allotments are treated as correct by default. The tablets do not justify their scales. They enforce them. Such enforcement implies a source of legitimacy beyond the scribe's authority. Notably absent are records of institutional founding. There are no tablets announcing the creation of an accounting office or the invention of a ration system. Administration enters the record as an inherited responsibility. Scribes write as caretakers of a process, not as architects of a new one. The speed with which this bureaucracy appears has long drawn scholarly attention. Yet the tablets themselves do not present speed as a concern. They behave as if the system has always been there. The clay simply becomes the medium through which it is expressed. If administration was already normalized when writing first appears, then writing may have been adopted to preserve an existing order rather than to create one. The tablets do not capture the birth of bureaucracy. They capture its continuation. As records accumulate, they begin to cluster around particular buildings, temples, storehouses, administrative rooms. The physical spaces that house these tablets seem designed to support the processes they record. And if the system of allocation and control assumed a stable spatial framework, then one might ask whether the buildings themselves were conceived with the same sense of inherited order that shaped the tablets stored within them. If administrative processes assumed spaces already suited to their work, then the buildings that contain those spaces demand attention of a different kind. The earliest temples of southern Mesopotamia do not present themselves as architectural experiments. They appear, from their first preserved phases, as structures bound to rules that are neither debated nor explained. Their proportions recur. Their orientations repeat. Their rebuilding follows lines that seem remembered rather than redesigned. At Eridu, the long sequence of superimposed temples is often cited for its depth. Less remarked upon is the consistency that runs through those layers. Each rebuilding respects the footprint of the one below. Walls are thickened, platforms raised, but the axis remains fixed. The temple faces the same direction across centuries of reconstruction. Flood deposits intervene, materials change, yet alignment persists. Builders appear constrained by a plan they did not author. Foundation inscriptions reinforce this constraint. Kings who rebuilt temples rarely speak of creative choice. They describe their work in terms of correction and return. Walls are set back into place. Platforms are made firm again. Measurements are described as correct or ancient, not improved. The language implies that deviation is possible, but undesirable. The proper form already exists as a reference. Ziggurats, emerging later as monumental expressions of temple architecture, exhibit similar discipline. Their corners align with cardinal directions. Their terraces rise according to consistent ratios. These features are not explained in surviving texts. No treatise survives that justifies orientation or proportion. The absence of explanation suggests that such choices were not considered optional. They belonged to an inherited canon. Archaeological surveys reveal that even when ziggurats are rebuilt after collapse, their cores are often preserved. New brickwork wraps around older mass. The building grows, but its center remains. This practice treats the structure not as a replaceable object, but as a continuous presence. To remove the core would be to erase something essential. In cities like and Uruk, temple precincts are spatially segregated from domestic areas, enclosed by walls that are repeatedly renewed along the same lines. Gateways reappear in the same positions. Processional paths are maintained across rebuilding phases. These features suggest that movement through sacred space was regulated by precedent. The path mattered as much as the destination. Inscriptions placed within foundations sometimes invoke the approval of gods, but they do so in a manner that emphasizes consent rather than instruction. The deity is said to accept the rebuilding, not to dictate its design. Acceptance presumes familiarity. The god recognizes the form. The builder's task is to meet expectation. Measurements themselves carry weight. Certain lengths and widths recur with minimal variation. While absolute units may shift slightly over time, ratios remain stable. This stability implies that proportion, not size, held significance. The builders worked within a system where relationships between parts mattered more than individual dimensions. Such a system requires memory to function. There is little evidence that temple architecture evolved through trial. Changes occur, but they are framed as restorations after damage, not as redesigns. Even innovations, such as increased height or added terraces, are justified as enhancements of an existing form rather than departures from it. The original plan remains authoritative. Texts describing temple origins often locate them in a time before named rulers. A temple is said to have been established in an undefined past. The verb does not specify who acted. The builder disappears. The structure stands as a given. Later kings enter the narrative only when the temple requires attention. The Anunnaki appear in architectural contexts as overseers of order rather than designers. They are associated with decreeing sacred spaces, fixing boundaries, and assigning domains. The physical act of building remains human, but the template is not. Builders act within parameters that are treated as external to human decision. Even destruction does not dissolve this framework. After floods or fires, rebuilding follows remembered lines. The city may suffer, but the temple returns. This return is not celebrated as resilience. It is treated as obligation. To rebuild incorrectly would be a failure of duty. If temples were constructed and reconstructed as if their forms were already known, then architecture itself becomes a record of transmission. Brick by brick, the builders inscribed memory into space. And if sacred geometry functioned as a language shared between gods and humans, one might ask who, within that system, was responsible for maintaining the rules when the builders themselves changed. If architectural form was preserved through adherence rather than invention, then the figures named in the texts associated with that preservation require careful attention. In the tablets where the Anunnaki appear, they do not occupy the position of originators. They are not described as bringing the world into being. Instead, they are shown administering a world that already requires organization. In compositions such as the Eridu Genesis and related narrative fragments, the Anunnaki enter scenes where structures of responsibility are already implied. The earth exists, humanity exists, labor exists. What is at issue is allocation. Tasks are divided, jurisdictions are clarified. The language used in these tablets focuses on assignment rather than creation. Roles are distributed, burdens are measured, authority is delegated. One recurring motif is the assembly. The Anunnaki are frequently described as convening, taking counsel, or sitting in judgment. These gatherings resemble councils more than moments of invention. Decisions emerge from discussion, not from spontaneous decree. The tablets preserve the sense of an administrative body responding to conditions rather than inventing them. The world is treated as something requiring oversight. In the Atrahasis tradition, the Anunnaki are associated with labor obligations. They are said to have borne work before its reassignment. When humanity is introduced into the system, it is framed as a redistribution of effort. The verbs emphasize relief, transfer, and substitution. Creation language is secondary. The primary concern is workload management. Legal authority also follows this pattern. Laws and ordinances are not authored by individual deities. They are set, fixed, or established. The Anunnaki appear as guarantors of these measures, ensuring that they are upheld rather than devised. When laws are violated, the response is corrective. The system itself is not questioned. In texts dealing with boundaries and domains, the Anunnaki are portrayed as assigning regions and functions. Rivers are placed under supervision. Cities are allotted patrons. Cosmic elements are given caretakers. The distribution implies pre-existing entities requiring order. The act is classificatory. The language resembles that of an archive being organized. Notably, the Anunnaki rarely speak in these texts. Their presence is reported rather than dramatized. When speech occurs, it is formulaic, concerned with procedure. Emotional expression is minimal. This restraint aligns with their role as administrators rather than protagonists. The tablets are not interested in their personalities. They are interested in outcomes. Absence is as important as presence. In several compositions, the Anunnaki withdraw. They return to heaven or leave their stations. When this occurs, disorder follows, not because the world ceases to exist, but because supervision has been removed. Flood narratives frame catastrophe as the result of administrative failure or suspension, not cosmic collapse. The relationship between the Anunnaki and other divine figures further clarifies their function. Individual gods often handle specific tasks, craft, healing, writing, but the Anunnaki operate collectively, overseeing balance. They do not replace these gods, they coordinate them. Their authority is systemic. Scribes copying these texts did not frame them as speculative. The tablets were preserved, taught, and referenced within scribal education. Lexical lists include divine names alongside offices and functions. This placement treats the Anunnaki as part of an ordered schema rather than as mythic inventions. Their roles were known, categorized, and stable. What is absent from these tablets is any sustained narrative of beginnings. There is no extended account of how land, water, or sky were first formed by the Anunnaki. Such concerns lie elsewhere, often with different deities. The Anunnaki enter after the fact, when order must be maintained. Their importance lies in continuity. This portrayal suggests that for the scribes, the question was not who made the world, but who kept it running. The Anunnaki embody that responsibility. They appear when systems are defined, when limits are set, when transitions occur. Their authority is procedural. If these figures were understood primarily as managers of an inherited order, then their prominence in texts concerned with measurement, balance, and duty may reflect how knowledge itself was categorized. And if order required constant supervision, one might ask how the rhythms of the heavens, so regular and precise, were understood within the same administrative framework. If order on Earth required oversight, then the regularity above demanded an even more exact form of care. The sky did not belong to any city, yet its movements governed every one of them. In the tablets concerned with stars, months, and omens, the tone shifts subtly but decisively. The language is not exploratory, it is preservative. The heavens are treated as a register already established, requiring maintenance rather than discovery. The earliest star lists do not present themselves as observations freshly made. They are structured as inventories. Constellations are named, grouped, and assigned seasonal positions. The lists assume that the stars already belong to an ordered system, one that can be recited, checked, and corrected. The scribe's task is not to search the sky, but to ensure that the record remains accurate. These lists often appear in pedagogical contexts, copied repeatedly with minimal variation. Their consistency across time suggests that deviation was discouraged. A star out of place was an error, not a new insight. The sky, like the city, had a correct arrangement that must be remembered. Calendrical tablets reinforce this impression. Months are aligned with agricultural cycles, ritual obligations, and celestial markers. The intercalation of months is treated as a technical adjustment, not an innovation. The calendar is not reinvented each year. It is maintained. When corrections are made, they are framed as restorations of balance, bringing the count back into alignment with a standard that exists independently of the scribe. Omen texts extend this custodial approach into interpretation. Celestial events are recorded not for their novelty, but for their correspondence to earlier records. An eclipse does not surprise, it is compared. The text asks whether it matches a known pattern, whether its timing aligns with precedent. Meaning emerges from similarity, not uniqueness. In these texts, the heavens function as an archive. Movements are signs to be read against prior entries. The future is approached through memory. The scribe does not predict, he recalls. What will happen is inferred from what has happened under comparable conditions. The assumption underlying this practice is that the system is stable enough for such comparison to be valid. Divine figures appear in astronomical texts primarily as guarantors of order. The moon god is associated with timekeeping. The sun god oversees justice through regularity. The Anunnaki, when mentioned, are connected to the fixing of destinies rather than to the movement of bodies. Their role is administrative. They ensure that the system remains intelligible. The technical precision of these records is notable. Angular measurements, rising times, and intervals are recorded with care. Yet the texts do not celebrate this precision as achievement. They treat it as obligation. Accuracy is not praised. Inaccuracy is corrected. The scribe works under the assumption that the correct values are already known, even if temporarily obscured. Astronomical knowledge is often embedded within temple contexts. Observations are tied to ritual schedules. The sky is not abstracted from institutional life. It is integrated into it. This integration reinforces the sense that celestial order is part of a broader administrative system governing both divine and human domains. Later compilations, such as the MULAPIN series, gather earlier material into comprehensive manuals. These texts explicitly frame themselves as collections of received knowledge. They preserve older observations, sometimes noting discrepancies without resolving them. Preservation takes precedence over synthesis. The archive grows, but its foundation remains intact. What is absent from these tablets is a narrative of discovery. There is no account of someone first noticing a pattern, first naming a star, first aligning a month. The silence suggests that such moments were either forgotten or never considered relevant. The value lay not in origin but in continuity. If the sky was treated as a managed domain, its patterns maintained through careful record-keeping rather than exploration, then astronomy becomes another form of administration. The heavens are not conquered by knowledge, they are stewarded by memory. And if such memory required precise numerical relationships to function across generations, one might ask how those relationships were formalized well enough to remain stable when the scribes themselves changed. If the heavens were maintained through careful numerical recall, then the numbers themselves require attention. The mathematical tablets of southern Mesopotamia do not read like records of discovery. They operate within a framework already stabilized, already accepted, already shared between scribes who did not pause to justify its premises. Calculation appears not as invention, but as execution. The sexagesimal system enters the record fully formed. Base 60 governs time, angle, area, and quantity with remarkable consistency. Tablets dealing with land measurement, grain distribution, and construction ratios all employ the same numerical logic. There is no tablet that explains why 60 was chosen. There is no competing system recorded alongside it. The choice is treated as settled. Early metrological lists reinforce this impression. Units of length, area, volume, and weight are presented as equivalencies rather than definitions. A given measure is shown to correspond to another, not to be derived from first principles. These lists function as reference tools, not instructional arguments. The system they preserve is assumed to be authoritative. Mathematical problem tablets extend this assumption further. They pose tasks involving fields, canals, and walls, providing solutions without commentary. The problems do not introduce new techniques. They apply established ones. Steps are often omitted, suggesting that the intended reader already knows the method. The tablet records the result, not the reasoning process. Some tablets present tables of reciprocals, squares, and coefficients. These are not exploratory calculations. They are tools for efficiency. A reciprocal table presumes that division will be required and that speed matters. Such tables imply a working environment where calculation supports administration, construction, and planning. Mathematics serves continuity. The precision of these tablets is notable. Fractions are handled with care. Large numbers are managed without difficulty. Yet the scribes do not comment on the sophistication of their work. There is no sense of novelty. The mathematical language is restrained, procedural, and quiet. It reflects confidence rather than curiosity. In building inscriptions, numerical relationships appear without explanation. Dimensions are given in ratios that align with known mathematical tables. The builder records length and width as if their relationship carries meaning beyond practicality. Measurement is not merely descriptive. It is normative. Correct proportions matter. The same is true in administrative contexts. Grain rations are calculated according to fixed scales. Labor is quantified in standardized units. These units are not negotiated. They are enforced. The tablet records compliance with a system that already defines fairness and obligation numerically. Mathematics also appears in legal and ritual contexts, though often indirectly. Fines correspond to specific quantities. Offerings are measured precisely. Time is divided into regular intervals that govern procedure. The numerical order underlies social order, quietly shaping outcomes without drawing attention to itself. Divine figures associated with number are not portrayed as inventors. The god of writing and measurement is a keeper of records, not a creator of systems. Numerical order is treated as part of the world's structure, not as a human achievement. The Anunnaki, when linked to measure, appear as guarantors of balance rather than authors of arithmetic. What is striking is the absence of debate. There is no evidence of competing numerical frameworks, no record of transition from one system to another. The sexagesimal structure appears stable across centuries and contexts. Such stability suggests consensus established before the tablets we possess. This consensus did not require constant reaffirmation. It was embedded in practice. A scribe trained within the system did not question its foundations. He applied them. The mathematics he used connected seamlessly with astronomy, architecture, and administration, forming a coherent whole. If numbers functioned as an inherited language shared across institutions, then mathematics becomes another form of memory. It preserves relationships rather than events. And if such numerical memory governed allocation, proportion, and time itself, one might ask how it informed the rules that bound people to one another, rules that would need to be expressed with the same quiet certainty. If numbers preserved relationships and proportions across generations, then law preserved relationships among people. Early Sumerian law tablets do not describe innovation or invention. They do not record a sovereign declaring new rules. Instead, they present statutes as something pre-existing, to be maintained, restored, and enforced. The language is procedural, precise, and quiet, with authority deriving from continuity rather than creation. The earliest collections, such as fragments from Ur-Nammu's or Lipitishter's codes, begin with invocations that frame the ruler not as an originator but as one who establishes justice or restores order. The verb is telling. It does not imply novelty. The law is treated as inherited, and the king's duty is to return it to its proper function. Compliance is documented, transgressions noted, but the origin of the statute is never claimed. Legal formulas themselves reinforce this perception. Each case begins with a description of circumstances, followed by a prescribed outcome. Penalties are quantified in tangible terms: sheep, grain, or labor. The text assumes that both scribe and audience understand the context. There is no explanation of why these penalties are just, only that they correspond to the proper measure of transgression. The law exists within a framework, already agreed upon. Procedural elements in these tablets are consistent across time and city-states. Disputes are addressed by established officials. Witnesses, oaths, and compensation follow recognizable forms. The act of recording a decision is as important as the decision itself. Documentation ensures that memory of prior judgments endures. The process is methodical, unembellished, and continuous. In some tablets, the divine presence is invoked, but not as an author of law. The gods are called upon to witness, to confirm, or to sanction enforcement. Their authority functions as validation rather than innovation. Laws are administered in their name, yet the content remains unchanged. The divine role is custodial, maintaining alignment between human action and cosmic expectation. Comparison with administrative tablets reveals overlap. The measurement of fines and compensation often relies on the same numerical systems used for rationing or construction. Standardized units allow consistency across contexts. This precision reinforces the sense that law was embedded in a broader structure of inherited order, linking society, economy, and governance. Textual variants indicate careful transmission. Copies preserve exact formulations, with corrections made according to prior exemplars. Scribes take care not to introduce ambiguity. The formulaic language itself acts as a safeguard, ensuring that law is not misremembered or misapplied. Preservation takes precedence over adaptation. Even when new circumstances arise, such as shifts in population, trade, or urban layout, law responds by application rather than reinvention. Adjustments are framed as clarification or enforcement of pre-existing principles, not as new legislation. This approach treats law as a stable medium, rather than a flexible tool of innovation. The tablets rarely dwell on the moral reasoning behind the statutes. Justice is enacted, not argued. Punishments and compensations are delivered according to pattern, reinforcing predictability. The emphasis is on procedure and conformity. Law, in this sense, functions as memory, a codified reminder of what must be done to maintain order. If legal frameworks were transmitted as inherited structures, codified and preserved through meticulous record-keeping, then their function extends beyond the immediate society. They anchor human behavior within a system of continuity, where deviation signals disorder, not creativity. And if these frameworks existed alongside administrative, architectural, and numerical systems already treated as inherited, one might ask how the notion of justice itself was conceptualized in a world where restoration took precedence over invention. If law ensured continuity among people, then medicine preserved continuity within the body. Sumerian medical tablets do not narrate discovery or experimental processes. They do not describe a practitioner first testing an herb or measuring a poultice. Instead, treatments are transmitted as established knowledge, often attributed to divine instruction. The authority of the remedy derives from inheritance rather than invention. The diagnostic series known from Nippur and presents symptoms paired with treatments in a consistent formulaic style. Illnesses are described precisely. Fever, inflammation, or digestive disturbance is identified with standardized terminology. Remedies follow without discussion of origin or reasoning. A plant is applied, a mixture ingested, a ritual recited. The text implies that the correct method already exists. The scribe's role is to preserve it. Divine attribution is frequent. Certain gods are connected to specific ailments and their cures. The god of wisdom may instruct the scribe on eye diseases, while the goddess of childbirth offers guidance on labor. Instructions are not conveyed as suggestions to be tested. They are authoritative, their efficacy assumed because the source is treated as trustworthy. This framing situates medicine within a broader structure of inherited knowledge. Procedural consistency extends to preparation. Quantities are precise, sequences deliberate. A tablet from the Old Babylonian period records a formula for fever, specifying exact measures and timing. Deviations are not proposed. The tablet does not speculate on alternatives. The text is intended as a record for practitioners who will execute the treatment, not invent it anew. Symptomatology itself is cataloged in a manner resembling administrative record-keeping. The tablet lists cases by observation, matching known patterns. Remedies correspond to these patterns. The relationship is methodical. The aim is preservation and application, rather than experimentation. A scribe ensures that the memory of prior cases and their treatments endures. Incantations accompany physical remedies, integrating the divine as guarantor of efficacy. The language is formulaic, often invoking protection or balance rather than initiating a new process. Healing is not depicted as discovery, it is a restoration. Illness is countered by reinstating the correct order, whether through the application of substances, incantation, or both. The tablets also reflect a careful taxonomy of ingredients and tools. Herbs, minerals, and implements are listed with fixed measurements and instructions. Cross-references between tablets indicate that knowledge was shared across centers and that uniformity was valued over variation. This reinforces the impression of inherited authority. The treatment is known, and the record ensures its faithful transmission. Even when new conditions appear, remedies are framed as adaptations of existing formulas rather than inventions. A rare symptom might be treated by modifying a known combination, yet the method references precedent. The scribe's responsibility is to align new observations with established knowledge, preserving coherence within the corpus of medical wisdom. Practitioners themselves are portrayed as custodians. Their skill lies in correct execution, precise measurement, and faithful recitation. The text rarely emphasizes intuition or experimentation. Mastery is achieved through repetition and memorization. The system relies on continuity, ensuring that treatments remain consistent over time and across locations. If Sumerian medicine functioned primarily as a transmitted archive of established knowledge, then the act of healing becomes part of a larger administrative network, analogous to law, mathematics, and astronomy. Treatments exist to maintain order, reflecting inherited understanding of bodies, substances, and divine guidance. And if such knowledge was treated as preserved rather than discovered, one might ask how the boundaries between human observation and divine instruction were themselves maintained, and what role scribes played in keeping that balance intact. If the preservation of knowledge extended across law, medicine, and astronomy, then natural events posed both a challenge and a reminder of fragility. Flood layers in southern Mesopotamia reveal a sudden sedimentary break, a disruption that aligns with narratives recorded on tablets centuries later. The text does not treat the flood as the beginning of civilization. Instead, it presents it as an interruption, a pause in an existing order that needed to be reestablished. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Shurapak and Uruk show evidence of abrupt deposition, collapsed structures, and subsequent rebuilding. Pottery styles remain continuous across layers, suggesting that artisans resumed prior forms after the inundation rather than inventing new ones. Buildings are reconstructed on earlier foundations. Streets retain previous alignments. The cityscape itself preserves memory despite the interruption, implying that knowledge, architecture, and administration were treated as recoverable rather than starting anew. Sumerian texts recount the flood with remarkable consistency. The story of Ziusudra, like the later versions in other cities, describes the deluge as an event sent by the gods to reset human mismanagement. Survival is framed as preservation. The hero maintains continuity by safeguarding life, livestock, and knowledge. The narrative emphasizes restoration rather than creation, suggesting that the world and its structures existed before the flood and were to be reestablished afterward. Post-flood rebuilding inscriptions underscore this custodial approach. Temples, canals, and city walls are reconstructed according to prior plans. Measurements, alignments, and sacred orientations are repeated. Scribes often record that a ruler restored what had been lost, repeating formulas of dedication and offerings identical to those used before the deluge. The emphasis is not on innovation, but on faithful recovery. Flood layers also preserve a broader environmental memory. Archaeologists note changes in soil composition, salinity, and sediment type, yet these markers were interpreted in antiquity through observation and adjustment. Records suggest that subsequent management of canals, irrigation, and agricultural fields was attentive to the lessons encoded in these layers. Restoration required both practical oversight and adherence to inherited knowledge. In literary and administrative tablets, the flood appears as a temporal marker. Events are described as occurring before or after it, anchoring the narrative and bureaucratic record. Kings are often presented as restorers who returned cities, temples, and laws to their former condition. Even the divine order is framed as continuity. The gods resume their oversight, reestablishing a custodial hierarchy disrupted by the catastrophe. The flood also appears to have influenced the standardization of record-keeping. Tablets created after these layers are more numerous, systematically organized, and carefully copied. It is as if the interruption highlighted the need for preservation. Memory of law, measure, ritual, and administration could not risk another collapse. The event marks a shift toward meticulous archival practices. Myth and archaeology converge in the treatment of human responsibility. The flood is framed as a consequence of disorder, yet the survivor's task is reconstruction, not reinvention. Cities are not built anew. Laws are not rewritten from scratch. Treatments, measurements, and astronomical tables are restored. Continuity becomes the measure of civilization's resilience. If the flood represents a break rather than an origin, it challenges assumptions about beginnings. The past is not erased. It is temporarily inaccessible, awaiting careful restoration. Knowledge, authority, and order are resilient, carried forward by scribes, rulers, and priests who understood their role as custodians rather than creators. And if recovery depended on inherited structures across every domain of life, one might wonder how much of what survives today reflects what existed before the flood, and how the memory of catastrophe itself shaped the way the Sumerians recorded, preserved, and transmitted the world left behind. As the waters receded and the flood sediment settled across southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerian record turns its attention not to invention, but to restoration. Post-flood texts emphasize the careful return of what had been lost. Cities rebuilt upon former foundations, canals realigned, and temples reconstructed according to inherited plans. The language of these tablets is deliberate, precise, and measured, reflecting a worldview in which order had to be reinstated rather than devised. Foundation inscriptions from Ur, Nippur, and Lagash describe rulers who restore the city that had fallen or reestablish the walls that the flood had destroyed. The verbs employed are notable. They convey recollection, reinstallation, and reaffirmation. The king is not credited with originality. His authority is derived from fidelity to prior arrangements. Scribes record dimensions, orientations, and dedicatory formulas exactly as they had existed before the catastrophe. Measurement, ritual, and governance are treated as inherited knowledge to be applied once more. Administrative records echo the same continuity. Post-flood ration lists, labor assignments, and tax tablets are consistent with pre-flood systems, using identical units, accounting methods, and formulas. The bureaucratic framework resumes without alteration, as though the pause created by the flood had been a temporary interruption of ongoing practice rather than an opportunity for innovation. Each tablet reinforces the principle that proper order was remembered, restored, and maintained. Literary texts similarly stress restoration. Narratives of kingship and divine mandate portray rulers as custodians who reestablish the temples, enforce the laws, and reassert the authority of the gods. Even mythological elements are presented in terms of continuity. The flood interrupted human activity, but the Anunnaki resumed oversight, distributing duties and maintaining the cosmic and social equilibrium as it had existed previously. These accounts frame the catastrophe as a disruption, not a new beginning. Archaeological layers confirm the textual emphasis. Buildings are reconstructed on previous foundations, streets maintain their former alignments, and pottery styles display continuity with pre-flood forms. The evidence suggests that the recovery of cities and institutions relied on inherited templates rather than ad hoc improvisation. Memory, codified in stone and clay, guided rebuilding at every level. Religious practice after the flood demonstrates the same principle. Ziggurats are re-erected according to prior measurements, with rituals repeated exactly as before. Offerings are calculated using standardized units, aligning with the restored administrative and economic structures. Priests and scribes functioned as intermediaries of memory, ensuring that the practices of the past were faithfully enacted in the present. Even technological knowledge is transmitted in this context. Construction techniques, canal engineering, and irrigation practices resume along pre-flood patterns. Tools, weights, and measures are reinstated, and their application continues seamlessly. The record does not celebrate innovation. It emphasizes fidelity and continuity, suggesting a civilization attuned to the preservation of inherited knowledge. This post-flood recovery also shapes historical consciousness. The flood becomes a temporal marker, a reference point for chronology, for lineage, and for authority. Events are framed as occurring before or after the inundation, situating rulers, scribes, and cities within a continuum. Knowledge is not merely applied. It is remembered, cataloged, and reaffirmed. Restoration itself becomes the principle by which the world is understood. If the post-flood texts treat restoration as the primary act of rulership and record-keeping, then the narrative of civilization is one of preservation rather than innovation. Knowledge, law, architecture, and ritual are reestablished because they are regarded as essential to continuity. And if the flood is remembered as a break rather than a beginning, one might ask how the memory of that disruption shaped the way Sumerians approached every subsequent act of governance, construction, and administration. As post-flood cities reestablished their walls and temples, scribes turned their attention to what could be most meticulously preserved: records of presence and absence. Temple and palace archives contain thousands of clay tablets detailing offerings, allocations, and ceremonies. Yet these texts often emphasize the gods as distant, observing, or withdrawn. The act of recording itself becomes a form of custody, a way to maintain contact with forces whose physical presence is neither assumed nor visible, but whose authority persists across time and space. Ration lists and dedicatory tablets illustrate this principle. Grain, oil, and livestock are assigned to particular deities with precise measurements, times, and locations. The texts do not depict the gods receiving these offerings in a literal sense. Rather, they ensure that every allocation is documented and accounted for. Absence is treated as part of the system. The deity may be physically removed, yet their authority is asserted through careful archival practice. In this way, the archive functions as a bridge between the human world and the divine order. The tablets reveal a layered administrative consciousness. Each entry identifies the responsible priest or official, the quantity of the offering, the intended divine recipient, and the context of the ritual. Repetition of forms, numerical consistency, and cross-referencing between archives underscore that what is absent must be tracked with equal rigor as what is present. Memory, not sensory verification, ensures accountability. The archive itself becomes a repository of both matter and meaning. Some inscriptions highlight gods who are described as having departed or withdrawn from a temple or city, yet offerings continue as though to reinstate presence. The act of recording ensures continuity despite absence, reaffirming hierarchies and obligations. In some cases, lists specify that a deity's statue or cult object is temporarily relocated, yet provisions follow according to established schedules. Presence is enacted through ritualized documentation rather than direct observation, and the text preserves the coherence of the system. Archaeological evidence complements these textual practices. Excavated archives in Nippur, Ur, and Lagash contain thousands of tablets stored in orderly rooms, often inscribed with administrative notations on both sides. Seal impressions indicate oversight and validation. The careful cataloging mirrors the structured allocation of resources, reinforcing the principle that the record itself sustains authority and memory, even when the subject of attention is distant or absent. Language plays a critical role in this preservation. Verbs denoting given, assigned, recorded, and set aside appear repeatedly, suggesting that the act of documentation is inseparable from the act of provision. The archive does not merely register transactions, it enacts them. By writing, the scribe ensures that absence is acknowledged, regulated, and incorporated into the ongoing flow of civic and religious life. Even in cases where offerings are symbolic, small quantities of incense, miniature models of animals, or token amounts of grain, the archive records them as carefully as substantial tributes. This meticulous attention implies that continuity is valued above magnitude. The system treats absence as meaningful, and the precision of record-keeping reinforces stability and preserves the memory of the divine order for future generations. Through these archives, the Sumerians cultivated a culture in which the unseen could be managed, obligations could be fulfilled, and authority could be maintained. The tablets do not narrate the sensory presence of the gods, nor do they claim direct interaction. Instead, they document custody, the careful accounting of what is given, expected, and remembered. The archive itself becomes an instrument of continuity, a memory of both absence and responsibility. If absence can be preserved with the same rigor as presence, and if the divine can be acknowledged through records rather than observation, then one might wonder how much of Sumerian civilization was sustained by what was not seen, and how this attention to invisible authority shaped the broader structures of law, administration, and ritual that endured across centuries. Beyond the boundaries of Mesopotamia, fragments of comparable memory appear in early civilizations across the ancient world. In Egypt, inscriptions on temple walls occasionally recall rulers and cities of a prior age, emphasizing continuity of ritual and kingship. In the Indus Valley, urban layouts and standardized weights suggest inherited conventions rather than emergent design. Even in early Chinese records, dynastic chronicles reference prior periods of order disrupted by floods or conflict, emphasizing restoration over invention. These parallels do not imply direct contact with Sumer. Instead, they reveal a recurring human concern with preserving inherited structures and knowledge across generations. The comparative lens highlights a striking consistency in how these societies frame temporal authority. Sumerian tablets describe rulers reestablishing cities, codifying laws, and allocating labor according to precedent. Similarly, Egyptian records stress the reinstallation of cult practices and alignment of temples to celestial patterns, often attributing these practices to divine or semi-divine figures. The underlying principle is consistent. Civilization is conceived as a system to be remembered and restored, rather than newly created. Each culture negotiates the tension between absence and continuity, recording what must endure even when the original actors have departed. Material culture reinforces these textual patterns. Archaeological layers in distant regions reveal cities rebuilt atop older foundations, with construction techniques preserved across generations. Standardized measurement, urban grids, and ritual architecture recur in ways that suggest inherited frameworks rather than independent innovation. In Sumer, the presence of foundation stones, rebuilding inscriptions, and administrative continuity mirrors similar patterns elsewhere, emphasizing that the replication of order is a fundamental concern in early complex societies. Even mythological narratives share this motif. Flood stories, divine intercessions, and accounts of rulers descending from celestial sources appear in multiple early traditions, each framing catastrophic or disruptive events as interruptions in continuity rather than origins. The Sumerian king list, with its pre-flood reigns and post-flood restorations, resonates with Egyptian and Mesopotamian chronologies that similarly emphasize recollection and reinstatement. The language and structure of these accounts suggest that the memory of disruption, rather than the act of creation, defines historical consciousness. Administrative records further illustrate these parallels. Across regions, tablets, inscriptions, and accounting systems document allocations, labor, and religious duties in ways that assume prior consensus. Scribes are charged with preserving consistency, ensuring that measures, names, and rituals align with inherited protocols. The act of writing itself becomes a method of maintaining continuity, extending the reach of absent authority and safeguarding institutional memory. In this way, Sumerian practice is mirrored in other early civilizations, each employing archives to bridge gaps caused by absence or catastrophe. Even without evidence of interaction, these parallels suggest a shared human preoccupation with preserving what has come before. Complex societies appear to develop similar strategies for codifying memory, restoring order, and safeguarding authority. The emphasis lies not in the novelty of invention, but in the fidelity of transmission, a principle that informs urban planning, administration, law, and ritual alike. The convergence of approach across diverse regions underscores a broader pattern of inheritance as the organizing principle of civilization. If distant civilizations independently developed analogous systems of restoration, record-keeping, and continuity, One might ask whether the impulse to preserve inherited order is as significant a driver of early societal development as innovation itself. Could the Sumerian example, when viewed alongside these global parallels, represent not an anomaly but a window into a recurring human method of maintaining memory across generations? The threads of Sumerian records, from early proto-cuneiform tablets to post-flood archives, converge on a recurring question: what does it mean to be left behind? Across texts, cities, temples, and rulerships, the language conveys both absence and presence, withdrawal and continuity. The Anunnaki, invoked repeatedly, are seldom described as creators in the moment. Rather, they oversee, delegate, or disappear, leaving human actors to act within structures already established. The phrase "left behind" appears to carry multiple layers, encompassing practical, ritual, and symbolic responsibilities, each encoded into the administrative and literary fabric of the civilization. In considering the administrative tablets, the notion of being left behind takes on a bureaucratic dimension. Grain distributions, labor assignments, and temple provisions are meticulously recorded with reference to a divine or semi-divine authority no longer physically present. The scribe ensures that obligations endure in the absence of oversight, implying that leaving behind is not abandonment, but a transfer of stewardship. Accountability persists, codified in the clay itself. In this sense, what is left behind is a system of memory, a tangible framework that safeguards both material and symbolic assets. Urban archaeology provides another lens. Foundation inscriptions, ziggurat measurements, and rebuilding layers repeatedly indicate that settlements were reconstructed according to inherited blueprints. Even after destruction or flood, human actors follow prior specifications, reaffirming the sacred and administrative orders embedded in earlier eras. To be left behind, then, is to inherit not merely ruins but a template for governance, ritual, and social coordination. The city itself becomes a medium through which the past is continually consulted and respected, as if continuity were as vital as survival. Mythological texts further nuance the concept. When the Anunnaki are said to descend, assign, or withdraw, their departure is treated not as a cessation of care, but as the initiation of human responsibility. Duties, laws, and boundaries are established prior to their absence, suggesting that leaving behind is inseparable from the expectation of ongoing management. The divine presence lingers in the form of obligation, ceremony, and archival record. In this way, left behind does not imply neglect. It implies trust in those who remain to sustain inherited order. Comparative perspectives illuminate the subtlety of this notion. Across early civilizations, disruption, disaster, or the disappearance of authority figures does not necessarily result in innovation. Rather, continuity is emphasized. The Sumerian example, with its repeated attention to cataloging, ritual, and reconstruction, aligns with a broader pattern in which what is left behind is meant to endure. The emphasis is not on creating anew, but on preserving, restoring, and recollecting. Absence becomes a measure of responsibility rather than liberation from precedent. Even in practical language, the tablets reinforce this interpretation. Terms associated with descent, allocation, and departure recur alongside verbs for recording, counting, and safeguarding. Scribes and administrators treat absence as an element to manage rather than a void to fill. The act of documentation, whether in grain lists, legal formulas, or temple offerings, transforms what might otherwise be a gap into a sustained channel of influence. Leaving behind is therefore entwined with vigilance and memory. Yet ambiguity persists. Some texts hint at the possibility that being left behind could entail exposure to the consequences of prior decisions, floods, famine, or conflict. The tablets record both continuity and failure, stability and collapse, often without distinguishing between divine and human responsibility. The line between stewardship and abandonment is deliberately porous, suggesting that the Sumerians themselves may have understood the process as neither entirely voluntary nor entirely imposed. Being left behind encompasses both inheritance and the necessity of ongoing action. In synthesizing the evidence, a pattern emerges. Sumerian civilization repeatedly frames inheritance as active rather than passive. Clay tablets, architectural plans, and mythic accounts all stress that what survives does so because it is attended, recorded, and respected. Yet this attention does not eliminate uncertainty. The past is preserved but not controlled. Custody is entrusted, not guaranteed. The departure of oversight figures, whether human or divine, creates space for human agency to operate within the frameworks left behind, always bounded by the structures of memory and obligation. The question, then, remains intentionally open. When the texts describe the world left behind by the Anunnaki, are they depicting abandonment, stewardship, or something in between? A threshold where responsibility is passed, continuity is demanded, and the very act of recording becomes a form of survival. And if leaving behind is inseparable from memory, how does this understanding shape the Sumerians' relationship to their own civilization, to the forces they revered, and to the fragments of order they endeavored to maintain across generations? If you found value in this exploration of what the Sumerian tablets actually reveal about Earth's transformation during the Anunnaki era, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about what aspects of this ancient period you find most fascinating. Where are you watching from tonight? What questions does this material raise for you? I love hearing from everyone who joins these journeys into humanity's deepest past, learning what perspectives you bring and what insights you've gained. Until next time, may your exploration of history be guided by careful scholarship, critical thinking, and genuine wonder at what our ancestors actually achieved. Not what modern theorists wish they achieved, but what they actually did through intelligence, creativity, cooperation, and tremendous hard work over many generations. The real story of the Anunnaki era is more compelling than any science fiction. It's the story of how humans transformed themselves and their world, creating civilization from wilderness, order from chaos, and leaving behind a legacy that still shapes our world today, over 5,000 years later. Thank you for watching.